What if everything came with a free Star Wars audiobook from Audible? Like at the cantina.
I'll take a half-cap spotchka, lightweight.
Here's your free audiobook download for Master and Apprentice from Audible.
Or getting your pod racer serviced.
My pod racer needs upgrades to the coupling and stabilizer.
And here's your free audiobook download for Resistance Reborn from Audible.
Life in the galaxy doesn't work that way, but there is one place you can go where you can get a free Star Wars audiobook from Audible. And that's utini.com/audible. Click the Audible logo and start your 30-day free trial, which includes a free audiobook download. So visit utini.com/audible and get your free Star Wars audiobook download today. Welcome to the Living Force Podcast.
Trust the Force.
A Utini production.
Rebellions are built on hope.
Episode number 62, interview with Alexander Freed.
Admiral, this is
Blue Leader standing by.
This is Gold Leader standing by.
This is Red Leader standing by.
On this episode, the Utini team chats with Alexander Freed, author of Battlefront Twilight Company, Alphabet Squadron, Rogue One, A Star Wars Story, and Shadowfall.
Blue Squadron on me.
And now, here are your hosts,
Hold up a Hammerhead Corvette. I have an idea.
Dr. Corey Helton and Eric Eilerson.
All right, everyone, welcome to a special edition of the Living Force Podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Eric Eilerson. I'm joined by Dr. Corey Helton, and today we have abandoned Dr. Charles Hankel, and we are joined instead by a writer of a number of video games, including the massive Star Wars The Old Republic, comics spanning the universes of Star Wars, Dragon Age, Anthem, and more, a ridiculous amount of short stories and RPGs, and of course, Battlefront Twilight Company, the Rogue One novelization, Alphabet Squadron, and the upcoming Shadowfall. Welcome to the show, New York Times bestselling author Alexander Freed.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here.
Oh, thank you. We are so excited to have you. Obviously, with today, I believe, when we're dropping this, Shadowfall coming out, we have all been so excited to talk about your work, talk about your world, and we're going to get into that right now. Corey, do you want to start us off?
Yes, absolutely. Alexander, thank you so much for coming on the show. Such an honor to have you. We always kind of introduce this topic with authors that we have on. Tell us a little more about your experience with Star Wars. Like, did you see the films for the first time? Did you get into the comics? How did you first get into this big universe? And then how did you sort of cross the bridge from film, if that's how you got into it, into sort of books and comics, that sort of thing?
Sure. So, my first sort of vague childhood memory of Star Wars was, I think these were in the days when you could rent both video cassettes and VCRs. You rented the entire device to play a video cassette on.
Wow.
And I have a very, very vague memory of watching The Empire Strikes Back that way. But the original trilogy was, that was an important part of my childhood. And, I loved those films. I did watch them over and over on cassette. I never had the toys. I never, had, I didn't buy the Marvel comics back at the time.
Mm-hmm.
I had a couple of the, photo novel, children's, recaps of the films, but that was kind of it. And as much as I love them, and as much as they sort of influenced my love for space opera, I kind of left Star Wars behind as I got older. I saw the prequels when they came out, but that didn't reignite a sort of love of Star Wars as a sort of franchise whole for me. They were, that's an interesting movie.
Mm-hmm.
I got a little bit into the Dark Horse comics just because some of the writers who were working on that material, John Ostrander, I was a huge fan of him from other work, and that sort of gave me a little bit of insight into what the whole EU was about. But I didn't really get back into that world until kind of through happenstance. I ended up working on a Star Wars video game. I had joined up with BioWare as a writer not not knowing that was the specific project that I was going to end up on.
Oh wow, that's a fun email to get then.
Yeah. So I suddenly found myself on this massive Star Wars project and having to get back up to speed, and also to kind of approach it fresh as a writer for the first time. Having been away from the bulk of what Star Wars was and all of the tie-in books and comics and so on and so forth. I sort of had to find a creative path into it rather than a path as a fan, which I think helped me, figure out what I was going to do with that. I think if I had come into it after being just utterly saturated in EU material, I would have had a hard time separating the stuff that I really enjoyed taking in and that appealed to me as a fan versus the stuff that I might actually be good at and be able to contribute as an author.
Oh, right. So it kind of helped you be a little more objective in that sense.
I think so, yes.
Nice. Yeah, so on that note, you really have, over your career so far, written in like every medium imaginable, from like novels, like we said, short stories, comics, obviously video games, and even RPG books themselves. Do you find that you have a favorite medium to write in? And even if you don't, why do you like to jump around from kind of world to world like that?
I'm not sure I have a favorite, but I do find, I talk a lot about this whenever anyone gives me the opportunity. One thing that delights me is figuring out the strengths of any given medium and then working to those strengths when, that's the project that I'm on. So I find that if I go too long without, working in prose or, writing a branching narrative video game, I start getting a hankering for that because I start thinking like, these ideas as I'm working on this book, like I can't actually use these in a book. They're not appropriate for a book and they're piling up in the back of my head and I want to, go over and do a video game for a while. Being able to play to those strengths, being able to sort of get into characters' heads really, really thoroughly in a novel versus, everything that interactivity can give you in a video game or, collaborating with an artist on a comic book. That's what really gets me excited.
Awesome.
That's awesome. Yeah, you already kind of mentioned the Old Republic a little bit. That was like probably one of the first games that I followed its development from very early on until when it was released. And I played it a lot back in the day. I haven't touched it in years. But like I remember the development of that game was so long. Like it seemed like it just went on and on and on and on. We heard rumors, and then the story finally came out, and it was incredible. A lot of part of the community like really enjoyed playing that. Can you tell us a little bit more what it was like to work on that game, like what that process was like? I mean, had you done video game work up to that point, or was that kind of the first thing?
That was my first video game project. I'd been writing in other fields before then, but that was my first video game. And it was huge, right?
Yes.
You're not wrong about the lengthy development period. Part of that, it looked a little longer from the outside, I think, just because it was announced early.
Sure.
And, so many AAA video games, they have 3 to 5 year development cycles anyway.
Yep.
I think Old Republic was maybe 5 or 6 years total. So it was on the long end, but it was also a ridiculously huge game. Yeah, I know you had a question in there, but yeah, it was my first video game project, and I learned so much across the course of it.
Yeah,
it was a fantastic team. One of the things that the size of that team and the skill of that team, in the years since that game launched, and many of those people have gone elsewhere, like. I now know people there's this diaspora of Old Republic alumni across the entire industry. And it's always delightful to, look at, some company or meet up at some conference. Like, oh, wow, you're there now.
Right.
That's fantastic. So what is that process like? I think working on a game. I'm very interested in that. I think we have a good idea. I think what it's like to work with like the Story Group and Lucasfilm and Del Rey. As far as novels go, we've talked to enough authors. I think we have a decent idea of what happens behind the scenes there. But like, what is it like working on a game, and how is that process like different?
Sure. I mean, the games industry is. It is diverse in its processes. So, depending on the game, depending on the level of focus on the story for a given game, where writers come in is going to be very, very different. The way things were handled at BioWare, BioWare really, emphasizing, the nature of story and narrative within their games. Writers come on board very, very early on, before any sort of, code is put down or art has been determined. You've got writers in there at the very, very beginning, and, producing plot documents and, ideas in parallel with the development of everything else. For Old Republic, we had vast amounts of the story and dialogue actually written before we really had a finished engine at all. And we were a little bit on the early side, but it's very common for a story-based game to write content and put it in sort of what we call white box levels. So, levels that don't necessarily have art or, proper gameplay, but where you can sort of play through something vaguely resembling what the final thing will be, just to test the story aspects for pacing, to make sure that, these things work on a basic level, because once you start going to voice acting, once you start locking down all the writing, you don't want to then get to the point where you go, oh, you know what? No one understands this plot point. We actually need to make some major changes here, which means not only do we need to re-record all the lines, we actually need to redesign the layout of the level. We need to put this quest over there because it really interrupts the flow. So you want to get as much of that figured out as you can before all of the other assets are locked down. And of course, you're never going to do that perfectly. There's always stuff constantly churning through, but you try to mitigate that.
Sure.
Wow. So jumping still in the video game realm to something a little different, a large part of our community loves playing Battlefront 2 on all kinds of different platforms, but they probably don't know what you may have done on Battlefront 2. Can you tell us a bit about combat barks and what those are?
Sure. So combat barks are the thing that pretty much no writer in the world wants to do, but actually take quite a lot of work and at least a bit of skill. So combat barks are when you're playing the game, when someone shouts, "Over there!" or "I'm hit!" or "I've come to get you!" Or whatever. Those are the combat barks. And, everyone recognizes a game that does them badly, right? Because you hear the same ones over and over again. They're weirdly specific. So, you're like, why is the guy saying that exact thing every time? Like, what an odd reference to his brother. Like, do all of these people have brothers? And, for a game like Battlefront 2, you need thousands and thousands of them. And, obviously, multiplayer mode of Battlefront 2 is not a deeply story-driven experience, but it is a narrative-driven experience, right? So much work has been done on every level to sort of get the feeling of Star Wars, of those particular battles, of those eras, and the sort of background dialogue is just another layer of that. So... I worked with the DICE team on the Barks. They were great. There are companies that I've worked with that don't really care that much about, the nature of their combat barks and just sort of leave it for the very end and stuff in, not quite as many as they should. The DICE team was fantastic. They were like, okay, how are we going to get this relatively background element of the game to be as sort of compelling and appropriate and layer in as much flavor as we possibly can. We had lots of talks about, okay, how often are these going to play, how much humor should they have, how much should they be informational for the player to sort of tell them what's going on versus just trying to evoke specific feelings and senses of being in the fray in the moment. I ended up writing many combat barks for Battlefront.
Awesome.
That's hilarious. So speaking of Battlefront, your book Twilight Company was one of your huge forays into the Star Wars expanded universe, I suppose, in a lot of ways. Like that game or that book didn't really have it was sort of related to Battlefront, but also sort of separate. Can you tell us a little more about how that project kind of came about?
Sure. So, Twilight Company was released in conjunction with the first new Star Wars Battlefront game, which did not have a story mode.
Right.
So when Del Rey reached out to me about doing a Battlefront novel, we had some discussions about what does that actually mean?
Sure.
Like what does that mean when you don't have an actual story connect to? And the answer that we sort of determined was, all right, well, we want to be going to at least some of those same locations. We want to evoke the same sort of Star Wars thematic imagery, right? So you've got a novel about a large force of sort of on the ground troops, which is very much sort of what your in the moment experience for the game is. I tried to make sure that there was plenty of sort of flavor of, hey, what are these weapons actually like? Not getting too tech head into it, but
right,
making that an aspect of the narrative, making it appropriate that you had characters who cared about these things. But I also got a pretty free hand on where I wanted to go with it story-wise, which made it super rewarding, right? Like, it's nice to be told, kind of do whatever, just make it feel Battlefront-y.
Sure.
That's great.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And Alexander, you are certainly kind of known as being one of the more, dare I say, technical writers in the expanded universe. Do you find, on a project like the Twilight Company book, do you have to like hold back a little bit with the tech descriptions of weapons and technology and that kind of thing?
I don't really. I mean, the thing of it is, I don't think of myself as someone who is particularly interested in that material. I think of myself as someone who is writing characters who should be interested in that material.
I see.
Right? When you've got a character, like the lead in Battlefront, like Namir, who's sort of, he's a soldier's soldier, right? Like he cares about, both his people, but also the tools that are going to keep him alive or not. Someone in that situation is going to have at least some, gearhead instincts.
Right.
The same is sort of true in Alphabet Squadron. Like, it just didn't make sense to write these pilots who were not intimately familiar and constantly thinking about their ships and how they're operating. The same way, if you were writing, a novel about a NASCAR driver, they would probably be thinking a lot about how their car was working as they drove.
Right.
Right.
So I've ended up in this place where I'm writing a lot of tech stuff, and I enjoy doing it. But it's not something. It's not an inherent draw for me as a writer.
Interesting.
Right. So, taking off of Twilight Company, Star Wars fans then really got to know you with your adaptation of Rogue One, one of our favorite films here. Corey, I know it's still your favorite film, right?
It is mine.
Yeah.
It is my favorite Star Wars film. It is. Yeah.
What was it like for you adapting the first non-saga Star Wars film? I mean, that must have been huge.
Yeah, I mean, it was a huge opportunity. I was surprised to get it. I was surprised to get that email one day. The biggest thing for me about it was actually, I'd never written a novelization before, and it's a really strange thing to do, right? Sure. Like as an art form, figuring out how to take this movie that you can pretty well assume that almost all of your readers have already seen, and give them something that is still worth their time to read.
Right. Yeah.
Sure.
Right? Because, if you've seen the movie is going to do so much better than the book is going to.
I don't need to read the book. I've already seen the movie.
Exactly. So what do you have to offer in the book that the movie is not offering? And figuring that out and doing it page by page was an interesting challenge.
Yeah. Do you have anything specific that you really loved being able to put in the book, whether it's like an additional scene, an additional expansion of a character that like you really personally loved?
Sure. I enjoyed kind of all of the internal work that I ended up doing with Jin, sort of getting into her thought processes. That was really enjoyable. On the more just sort of pure fun side, so the Rogue One novel has a number of sort of non-fiction in-universe manuscripts and emails and so on and so forth, sort of with their own little sections, and those were great fun to write. Getting to write sort of the email exchanges between Galen and Krennic and Tarkin, and their petty bickering and what that looks like inside the bureaucracy. That was a lot of fun.
Good. I would like to order at least 18 books of bickering bureaucracy with Krennic and Tarkin, please.
Just emails.
Yeah.
Release the emails. Yeah.
So and on that note of you loving to write Jin so much, obviously Jin plays a decent role in Alphabet Squadron as Chas's kind of inspiration. She talks about her. Was it writing Jin in Rogue One that was like made you fall in love with that character a bit more to put her as that inspiration in Alphabet Squadron?
Sure. So, I mean, writing Rogue One meant that everything from Rogue One is more easily accessed in my brain.
Yeah, sure.
So, when I hit something in a book where I'm like, okay, so I want to tie in something here, or I want an existing Star Wars element, or is there anything that I can use here? It doesn't matter how many times I've seen the other films. Like, my brain sorts through the Rogue One stuff with a different set of algorithms because I had my hands in it. So, I'm not going in there thinking like, wow, I want to squeeze in a lot of Rogue One stuff, but I see opportunities to connect to Rogue One in ways that I don't with other material, and I don't think that's a bad thing. Like, why not?
No.
Let's throw some Rogue One
Absolutely.
in here.
Yes. Always looking for more Rogue One. Absolutely. Let's talk about Alphabet Squadron a little bit. Obviously, I think a lot of fans had read both the Rogue One novelization and Twilight Company kind of before you got the opportunity to do the Alphabet Squadron book. But I think to a lot of people, Alphabet Squadron is really is what puts you on their own personal map, because a lot of fans were really looking for that sort of X-Wing series from Legends sort of thing in canon. And we've heard a lot of people say, I remember I said that our whole mission is to get people to come into the expanded universe. We've had a lot of people say that that's how they got into canon, actually, is like they were looking for something Legendsy, and deep in the bowels of the internet, Alexander Freed is often mentioned as being close to that sort of older X-Wing series. So how did this project kind of come about? Like, how did you get involved in this? How did those conversations kind of first begin?
Sure. So I was basically approached one day with, hey, we're doing a pilot trilogy. Do you want to write a pilot trilogy for us? And it was kind of that simple. So I was approached through Del Rey, but you know, I knew the folks at Lucasfilm as well, and you know, got in there for sort of a kickoff meeting. You know, they wanted to do a pilot-based trilogy with the with the sort of Alphabet Squadron concept of 5 different types of ships, 5 different pilots, going up against some sort of elite Imperial unit. That was all part of the pitch. The TIE Fighter comic book, that was also part of the initial pitch, that we're going to do this, sort of crossover between the novels and the comics. And that was most of it, right? Like there weren't characters attached to it. Harrison Dula was part of the initial pitch.
Beautiful.
But the characters of the pilots themselves were open. The time period was determined. We were going to do it post Return of the Jedi. But it was really, maybe half a page of here are the bullet points that we want to hit with this thing.
Interesting.
And yeah, I mean, from there, we sort of took it and ran with it and talked about how it was going to interface with the comic book side. And, I had a lot of discussions, with my editor, Elizabeth Schaefer, about, how did we want to craft this as a trilogy? Are we going to do sort of standalone books that loosely tie together? Did we want it to be one sort of mega thing? Thought a lot about, all right, how much do we want to, intentionally versus how much do we want to intentionally try to echo any of the original EU, X-Wing novel content or ideas? Are there other characters that we want to bring back, and so on and so forth?
Right. So, and within those conversations, you're talking about, crafting a trilogy, going from half a page of bullet points to like over 1,000 pages of story. What do you find is so interesting to people about trilogies? I feel like, obviously we have the films are all trilogies. And in trilogies and books, from Lord of the Rings on, seem to be kind of a nice format. What do you find that's interesting about like 3 books to tell one massive tale?
So, I think part of it is just we've become accustomed to that number, but on a more
particularly in Star Wars.
Well, sure, but I think what it allows you to do, whether it's 3 books or 4 books or whatever the exact number ends up being, it lets you. So a single book is enough space to give 1 or maybe 2 characters a really, really sort of deep, nuanced, character-based story. And every author is going to have their own sort of numbers on that, but that's what I find. And once you expand to several books, you can do that with several characters and see how all of that interweaves, and I think that's really rewarding, right? Like people like getting this epic that gives you full character stories for a cast and watching them play against each other and watching those stories influence one another. That's really hard to do in a single novel.
Definitely.
Interesting. So it sounds like it's always fun for us to kind of see behind the scenes a little bit, because we can kind of piece together sort of there's a lot of secrets in this industry, right? There's a lot of secrets with Del Rey and what the process of working and who comes up with ideas and that sort of thing. Like it sounds like you were pitched to use Hera and a couple other characters, that sort of thing. Did you have a lot of like kind of freedom and control to kind of come up with all the other individual characters completely on your own?
Yeah. I felt very fortunate to have as much freedom as I did with Alphabet Squadron. Obviously Rogue One, not a whole lot of right? Sure. I say that, but story group and everyone was very, very open to me sort of making up entirely new scenes, but ultimately like it's a book adapted from a film.
You gotta have Jyn Erso, you gotta have Chirrut, that's how it goes.
Yes, you can't change what happens to them.
They can make it out in the book, right? That'd be great.
Yeah, we can throw Kylo Ren in the middle, right? Like, he's cool.
Yeah.
We can just add him.
Yeah, we love him. He looked great on the cover.
Yeah.
So yes, I mean, there was freedom in some forms on Rogue One, less so in other ways. But sure, yeah, I mean, Alphabet Squadron, all of the characters except Hera, I think, were entirely original, not pitched from the Lucasfilm side. And certainly there were, what I have found working with the story group over the years is that they were very good at seeing and identifying opportunities, and also good about not pushing them. So,
Sure.
If they get an outline and they go like, hey, so, you've got this sort of side character who's, mildly important to your story, but not sort of a central focus. We've got a character a lot like that and something that we have coming up. Would you like to make that person the same character? And, if that works, then it's fantastic. And then sometimes as an author, you're like, well, actually, I was planning to kill this person off in book 2. So why don't we make this character a little more distinct from the character that you've got planned for something else, so that we don't feel like we're overlapping? And
Right.
yeah, one of the great things about working with the publishing side and story group and all the folks over at Lucasfilm is that they're very rarely prescriptive about this sort of thing, right? Like, they're there to inform and guide, but not to dictate. And yeah, I mean, there's been very few things that have come up from their end where I've been like, really, you're going to make me do that? Yeah, it's a pretty healthy relationship.
Great.
So being a trilogy of books, obviously you have, probably a fairly good general idea of how the whole trilogy is going to go. You have to think about it in that context from the beginning, I would imagine, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, one of the first things that I did was put together sort of, I think it was maybe 2 pages with an overview of the entire trilogy.
Okay.
Right? A nice tight, here's basically where we're going.
So I guess my follow-up question to that is how much do you, as the story of, like, say when you're writing Alphabet Squadron, for example, how much of the story of the later books also comes together? Like, do you find yourself having to keep all the documents open at the same time and, like, you frantically go and, like, fill in some story points for the second book? Is that how that works?
I'm sure it's how it works for some authors. From my part, so, I should talk a little bit about my outlining process in general. For
okay, yeah, sure.
So I am an incredibly thorough outliner. My outlines generally run about a fifth or a sixth of the length of the finished product.
Wow. Okay.
So for a 400-page book, that's 80 pages of outline.
Right.
And so I've worked a lot of that out mentally by the time I'm writing. And my outline for the entire trilogy was not nearly as thorough. I didn't write 3 books worth of outline before starting on book 1, but I had a good impression of what I wanted to do. And as I wrote the outline for book 1, I could have an eye to, okay, is this going to fit with what I'm steering towards?
I see.
Nice.
I see.
Awesome. So on that same kind of outlining, bigger process idea, did you have certain, like, books, movies, or stories outside of Star Wars that were, like, references or inspiration for you for Alphabet Squadron and Shadowfall?
Nothing really specific that was, this is the model. I did a fair amount of reading, about, real world pilot experiences and sort of the psychology of what that meant about PTSD, about, I did my research.
Yeah. Oh, it shows. I mean, just stuff you're talking about there from the first book. I remember we would talk about how, like, harrowing it was, especially with Erica with her PTSD and using the torture droid as that device. It shows that you did all that research for sure.
And thank you. I mean, there was no. it's more sort of a giant mash of ideas that you sort of put through the strainer that end up in the material, rather than this was exactly what I wanted it to feel like. And I could have used the original X-Wing novels for that, right? For a model of mood and feel. And I intentionally did not do that because I did not want to write a pale imitation of the X-Wing novels, which is what would have ended up happening, right? Like those,
100%.
Those are fantastic, beloved novels. And, Stackpole and Alston did amazing work with them, and I did not want to try to pretend to be either of them. So, that's why I wasn't sort of using them as my lodestone.
Fantastic.
Yes. We frequently have to have that conversation about, like I mentioned earlier, like a lot of folks come from sort of the Legends background or looking to get into canon, and we will often have to have the conversation about, like, yes, okay, there are sort of fighter pilot books in canon, but it's different, and you have to look at it different. It's more of a character study. We talk about that frequently. Like a lot of the canon books are much more focused on the characters. And your book, honestly, is one of the sort of big highlights. Alphabet Squadron is the big highlights of what really intense personal character study looks like. And I think people certainly enjoyed that a lot. So I guess my question is, how do you sort of balance such intense personal characterizations with your sort of military background that you're getting a reputation for a lot in Star Wars, right? You were on the military panel at Celebration last year. You've had some military kind of focused books. So how do you balance that sort of, it's big fancy combat and fights and bullets and all this kind of stuff with this sort of intense personal character development?
It's a good question. I mean, I think fundamentally the action scenes need to serve the character stories, right? There needs to be character-driven meaning coming out of those sequences, and part of the challenge doing a more military-focused novel in that regard, as opposed to, say, a more kind of traditional space opera-y novel, is that these characters who are in a military context aren't necessarily going to have the personal stakes attached to every given fight that they're having, because they're being ordered into situations that they're not necessarily choosing. When you look at Star Wars, right, Luke is very clearly deciding, I want to go have this adventure. I want to rescue this princess. I want to follow in the footsteps of my father. And every one of those encounters resonates with that journey that he is personally invested in. That is not necessarily going to be true if you are a soldier in a larger organization. So figuring out, all right, well, who are these characters such that, and what are we interested in exploring about these characters such that even the fights that don't seem to have personal meaning to them end up being an important part of their journey, or what we are revealing to the reader about them, is sort of, that's the challenge for me in a military focused novel that still feels like Star Wars.
Right. You hit it. For our part, I think that definitely shines through. And on that level of the technical element, moving away from the people to the ships to the actual text. You said earlier, you don't want to write this necessarily as tech head stuff, but you definitely write in a way that we can tell what the characters care about, especially Will, for instance. Will Lark, I've told a lot of people I freaking am obsessed with the dude, and the way he talks about his ship in Alphabet Squadron is very different from anyone else. He treats it almost as a friend, as an extension of himself, whereas someone like Nath treats his ship like, hold together, baby, like it's kind of, held together with duct tape. Do you have one of those ships or one of those character relationships that you really just love to write the most? And do you have, even beyond that, like a type of ship in Star Wars that you really just love to write about?
That's a really good question. So for the first part, a character ship relationship that I really enjoy writing. So this doesn't really show up until Shadowfall. I really enjoy writing the relationship between Soren Kais and his TIE fighter.
Listeners, I have read it. It's true. It's great.
Yeah, I'm not going to go into detail about sort of how much of that we see, but he is our Imperial Ace of Aces, and it's a while before we finally get to see him in a tie. And part of it is, of course, you look at it objectively, ties are kind of terrible ships, right? Like they fall apart if you scrape them too hard.
Yes.
Yeah.
So seeing, what makes an Imperial Ace actually passionate and excited about this thing and how it operates as an extension of him was a lot of fun to write. I mean, a lot of the pilot ship relationships are fun, but that's the one that springs to mind. Is like, yeah, I got a lot of joy out of that one. As for sort of personal favorite ship, I really enjoy the B-wing. It's such
so
a weird ship, and there's no reason in the world for it to be able to pivot around its own cockpit. Right? It's such an action figure of a ship, but figuring out fun things to do with that when you're writing a space battle, it's just really enjoyable.
Yeah. Especially with someone who is as opinionated as Chess about everything her ship does. I love that.
Yeah, I think
That's
doing
awesome.
the B-Wing with a more straight-laced pilot would probably be less fun. But Chas lets me go kind of crazy with the weird aspects of the ship.
For sure.
That's awesome. So I know we're kind of running out of time here, and there's probably a limited amount you can tell us about this, but it was just announced that you're going to be part of the Empire Strikes Back from a certain point of view project, right? Can you tell us anything about how your sort of involvement kind of came out with that? And I know they've not announced hardly anything about it. We know nothing, but everyone's starting to piece together kind of what authors are involved in. Obviously, your name is on the list. So kind of how did that come about? How did you get involved in that project?
Yeah, I mean, so I did a story for the first certain point of view. So,
Right.
I had an in there. And they were kind enough to reach out to me about doing the second one as well. The interesting things about those projects is always the claiming process.
I bet.
Right? Because there's a lot of characters in these films, but there's also a ton of authors on these projects.
Yes.
Everyone wants. We all want Wilro Hood. I get it, but only one person can write it.
Well, it's fascinating to see what goes fast too. I mean, I think I had gone into the first certain point of view project. Like I got the email, and there was, I don't remember if it was a Google Doc or how it was being done, but there was a list of sort of what was being claimed. I was like, okay, well, what are the two things that sort of first spring to mind? And I think, if I'm remembering this right, I was like, it'd be a lot of fun to do something with maybe the Dianaga and the trash compactor or the mouse droid. And I'd go to look at the list and be like, really? People have claimed those already? So
that's fantastic.
Yeah, the Empire Strikes Back version was a little bit similar, but I'm pleased with what I ended up claiming for myself. I can't really say a lot more beyond that, but lots more information on that one forthcoming.
Yeah, it's
awesome.
funny, you say that, and I'm imagining like a Wall Street office the second that it opens, and people are just running with like slips of paper, being like, "Don't worry, I want this, I want this, I want this." Oh, cool.
Put $20 on ice cream maker guy.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. So as we end up here, and again, thank you so much for talking about this stuff. We freaking love it. A quick plug, everyone. Shadowfall does come out today. If you don't have it yet, that's wrong. But the last thing we like to ask all of our authors is, Star Wars at its core is kind of all about legacy. It is about, the history of what you leave behind and all that stuff. So if you could pick, what would you like your legacy in Star Wars to be when people think of Alexander Freed?
Ooh, that's a tough one. I immediately go to either the Alphabet Squadron trilogy or the Old Republic. Those are the largest things that I have worked on. I was trying to mentally do the math not too long ago and figure out if I have written more Alphabet Squadron yet than I wrote for the Old Republic. And it's close. That is just a huge game.
Wow.
Just hundreds and hundreds of thousands of words of content to that thing.
That's crazy.
And there's so much of that game that I'm proud of. But I think if you absolutely made me choose, I'd probably end up with Alphabet Squadron. But don't make me choose.
No, I'll tell you what. We'll make sure that we keep plugging both every time we talk about you in the future. We'll ensure it.
I appreciate that.
Of course. Oh man. So hey, before we let you go here, let's make sure everyone can keep up with your work. Where can they find you online? And obviously, what do you have other than Shadowfall? What's coming down the pipe that we can look out for?
Sure. So best place to find sort of updates on what I'm doing is my Twitter feed. That's at Alexander M. Freed. I've also got a website which doesn't get updated quite as much as it should, but major projects do end up there. I've also got a lot of articles on writing and game writing in particular on my website, which fortunately are not terribly time sensitive, so people can wander through those archives. And that website is alexanderfreed.com. In terms of projects coming up, not a lot that I'm actually allowed to talk about right now. Doing plenty of games material that I'm looking forward to talking about publicly. And of course, I'm right now working on Alphabet Squadron 3, so that'll show up and get an official announcement somewhere down the line.
Yeah, which is called Alphabet Squadron 3. Okay.
Untitled third Alphabet Squadron novel.
Oh, yes. I knew that would be the title. That's what I had my money on. Awesome.
That's awesome. Well, thanks a lot for being here, Alexander. It's been a ton of fun talking to you. You've obviously had your hands on a lot of Star Wars projects, and it's always exciting to get to hear from the creators of what we love so much. So thanks a lot for being here, man.
That is going to do it officially for this week's episode. If you want to help out this podcast, you can find us over on patreon.com/Utini. We got all kinds of shows and awesome stuff coming your way. A special thank you to Cheryl Bell, Drew Ibarano, and Patrick Ortiz on our Jedi High Council, and Ross Orlando on our Alliance High Command for your amazing support. You can find us on Twitter. I'm at Eric Eilerson. Corey is at Doc Star Wars MD. A special thank you to Matt Davenport, our amazing editor, Freddie, our producer, and Wes, our co-host and community manager. And as always, may the Force be with you.
There is no hatred. There is joy. There is no division. There is union. There is no apathy. There is passion. There is no gatekeeping. There is community. This is the Utini Star Wars Fan Code. Embrace it, live by it, and above all, trust in the living Force. That's all for this week. Join our community and surround yourself with like-minded fans by visiting us online at utini.com. Until next time, may the Force be with you.